Welcome to the Lightwork Women podcast. We are experienced women with credibility. We know what life is like. Transform your life with our top-tier psychic and wellness services. We offer effective solutions tailored to empower you on your journey to spiritual wellness. In this podcast series, we talk about tarot, mediumship, Reiki, mental health, magic, witchcraft, and much, much more. We hope you enjoy our show. Please get a cuppa, have a seat, have a listen. And just remember, many hands make light work.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lightwork Women's podcast. Today I'm here with the lovely Robyn Ridley from Goddess Sanctuary. Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thanks, Tania. So good to be back together again.
It
We
is. I
seem
love
to get,
chatting with you.
yeah, we seem to meet in this lovely place to talk all things astrology, don't we?
Yes, we do. And today's topic is Saturn moving into Aries. So that's a really interesting transit. A little bit of information about, I think, Saturn as a general, for those who don't know. But Saturn actually has a 29-year approximately cycle around the sun. So if you're actually born in 1996 or 1967, you'll be having your Saturn return. Your first one would be now if you're about 29 years old, and your second Saturn return would be if you were born in the 60s. So that's really relevant, particularly with Saturn moving into Aries, because you'll be highly influenced and impacted by this particular transit and energy. And typically Saturn kind of sits within a sign around 2 to 3 years. So that's its kind of cycle. So we'll be experiencing Saturn in Aries for the next 3 years, and that change will occur at the end of May. So on that, I thought we could talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened in a Saturn cycle in the past. So that would have been, like I said, 1967 and 1996. And some of the themes that I came up with here were around what do we have? We have basically in the 90s, I'll work kind of in more the current. In the 90s, I've got some information that Dolly the sheep was cloned. So that was an interesting revolution. There was obviously some key wars happening around that time, around the Taliban and some of those significant sort of Middle Eastern impacts. Tony Blair was elected as a prime minister, and he was pretty young. He was in his early 40s, so that was quite a important, I think, representation of leadership and perhaps some of the themes that Saturn represents that we'll talk about. Princess Diana, she actually tragically died in a car accident in 1997, and I actually was in the UK when that happened, so that was a significant shift. But also in terms of the media and the shift around how the media responds to world issues. And then in the 1960s, and during that particular Saturn Aries, we actually had the tragic assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert K. Kennedy. We also had the Vietnam War, and there were some other revolutionary shifts around, obviously, Black Panther movement, if you're in America, and I think that was quite significant in American politics. Summer of Love was in 1967, and and then obviously there was a lot of protesting about the Vietnam War. So there's some pretty big themes there, and I think one of the takeouts I got out of the 1960s and the 1990s was this generational revolt, which is kind of when we think about Saturn as what does Saturn represent? So Robyn, I thought maybe you could give us a little bit of an outline of Saturn, and then we can tie into Aries and what it all means.
Yeah, well, it's a big one. And I think I just wanted to tap on what you said about the 90s. I found that fascinating because we know that the outer planets, it's a bigger picture, but also as within, so without. So we're looking at ourselves. And I had a little thought back to that period, 96 to 98. And it was really interesting because I was thinking, how did I grasp these energies? But I think I struggled. So I was actually working in a institutional type setting And it was new. It was after I'd finished university, and it was the road I had chosen. And I'm in this place, and I think it's so funny because I think even in Pisces, as it was before it moves into Aries, there's sort of this. It's more got that emotional content, but when I was in this institution, there was so much aggression, there was so much, there was so much going on, and I was ill-equipped to work with that on a personal level. It wasn't part of I had no foundation. So in actual fact, I hadn't worked with that type of energy of Saturn even. And so I had no foundation, and I thought, wow, because it was interesting, because then just taking it a quick step further, when it went into Taurus, is when I actually left all that and went into that self-care component, started working with flower essences and rada, rada, rada. And it was like this, oh my gosh. So I was unable to work with that energy on a personal level.
Well,
Interesting.
that's interesting because, Saturn is the taskmaster,
Yeah.
the Lord of, time and karma.
Yep.
And I think it's a very challenging uh, planet or energy to work with. But what I always feel when it comes to Saturn is that it's a slow moving energy, but it
Yes.
really impacts us on a personal level. So,
Mm.
because the transit only lasts for 3 years, but it's a steady and slow. So
Yeah.
perhaps what was Saturn was tasking you was to kind of step into your own power, your own leadership.
Hmm.
And that's a
Yeah.
really good example of Saturn in Aries being played out.
Yes.
Um, yeah, so
Yeah.
it's
Fascinating. So
it,
let's talk a bit about Saturn. We'll go away from that story because it was like, well,
okay.
okay, there was a learning curve. And that's what it is. It is one of the biggest, there's this whole idea about evolving, that comes with Saturn. But when we look at Saturn's here to get real. So let's get real, And can you imagine the difference as it's moved from Pisces into Aries, this getting real? It's been so used to the boundaries being blurred, or the boundary, yeah, dissolved. And now it's like, wow. So, that reality, and then bringing in the structure. And I really think foundations is important. But also there is a drive I think one of the biggest things that stands out for me is the accountability and responsibility that Saturn brings. And I look at that and I go, well, it's like it takes discipline. It takes discipline for all of those things. And it is a learning curve. Now, it's not going to be, because it's going into a whole new cycle, like it's moving in 0 degrees of Aries. It's a whole new cycle, and it's following in Neptune's footsteps. So one wouldn't even like to have it a guess as how they're going to hold hands and work together, because so we'll just keep it with Saturn. But I think this is a whole new chapter. So there is newness in this initiative type, leadership type role that can be had. And many refer to it as the cosmic reset button, which I think, yay, that's a good way to look at it. It is a point of no return. We can't go back. It's not like, okay, we're here. We're in this new moment, and looking at being sure of your own goals and where you're headed with that, and making sure that you set the stage for your own personal, revolutions, or thinking about fearless inventions, or your boundaries and all that sort of thing, all in the pursuit of your purpose. What is it? Where are you headed? I don't know. Tanya, what do you think? I think like we're shifting from the Pisces introspection to the Aries fueled initiative, aren't we?
Yeah, I think you were spot on when you were talking about this being a new cycle, which basically means Saturn has gone through all the constellations. It's
Yep.
kind of, Pisces is the last sign and
Yep.
Aries is the first, and we know we have a lot of these first moving into Aries in this period.
Yeah.
And so that enables this kind of evolution. And I think the themes, just some of the key things that I mentioned before about the 60s and the 90s, those themes are very similar. So now we're in this next generation. But I think there's another layer to this because we're kind of again starting from this new cycle scratch. And so yeah, I think there could be some power struggles. There can be
Definitely.
redefinition of what leadership is. We're starting to
Yeah.
see the tones. We just had our election here in the federal election, for those who might be familiar with Australian politics. And I think there was something really prominent in what happened on the weekend with, Labor taking full carriageway of, this new leadership.
Mm,
And yeah, I just think that's part of this narrative. There's this uprising, this standing up, there's this self-identity, because Aries is definitely about our identity. It is, as the self, the I, it's being
yeah.
driven.
Mm,
You're taking control, and taking ownership. And there might be some very impulsive energy because, Aries is impulsive, it's youthful, it
hmm
likes to provoke. It is an initiator, and in a really beautiful archetype, the warrior stands
hmm
up, pushes forward. So yeah, I think this is a time to, stand clear and probably fuse. We need to learn the lessons of Saturn. Saturn is
Yes.
mature. It
Yeah.
is responsibility. It is foundation and its structure. And I think with Aries, Aries can be a bit,
Yeah.
too off, like I'm just going to go do whatever I want.
Yes.
And whilst that needs to be a driver, it needs to be anchored with that Saturn overtone. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens on an individual perspective and also on a more global perspective around our identity, our willpower, the way we, uh, you know, channel our assertions,
Mm,
address our anger issues. Because I think globally we're being provoked. There's so many big changes happening, and people are starting, it's pressing everyone's buttons. So how do we respond and act? And I think Saturn's a good little um, messenger for us, with Aries, is to bring those two strengths together, because that's the whole point of them,
yeah.
wanting to come together. So yeah, what's your thoughts around that on a, whether it's an individual, whether it's your own
Yeah.
personal or on a global perspective?
Well, I have to say, when I first sort of Saturn coming into Aries, I thought, oh my God, because let's face it, it's not its favorite place to be. It's not happy there. And it also wasn't happy in Pisces. So it's just like, okay, there's things to be learned here. But I think we need to know there's a shift. What we might say, well, there's a new vibe shift, but it's actually full on identity renaissance. There's a whole identity is, like you said, that Aries, that I, it's all related. But I think what I love to think about is, Aries can make snap decisions and be impulsive, as you said. And I think Saturn says, let's create calculated risks. Yeah, because I think there can still be risk, but it needs to be calculated. And I think that's Saturn's purpose. We have to slow down. That's what's being asked of us. We're being asked to slow down, look first, remain patient, and then be accountable. And this, I mean, look what happens. And when you said about the aggression, it's like, okay, we're being asked to step up as leaders as well, like on the global and personally. So there can be concerns with starting afresh, and therefore it can result in those power struggles, like you said. But with that, you've got that horrible warmongering that can happen. And we have seen some examples of that. And then, of course, like you alluded to back in the past, the violence and even weapons of mass destruction. So this is when it can get out of hand. So for us, I think we're really being asked to take, like bold action, but also be self-reliant to some degree. And that way it warns us against the impulsive risks, if you like. So I think the big lessons in conflict management, great for all of us, whether it be in the workplace, in the home, or globally. And it's a good question. Will Saturn ground bold Aries? What do you think?
Ooh, I'm not sure if Saturn can ground bold Aries. Aries is
No.
really just want to fire
Yeah,
energy and take
exactly.
off. But
Yeah.
I think what they can do, and I was reflecting when you're talking about your experience, reflecting back in the 90s, between 1996 and 1999, it was a 3-year
Mm,
period, Saturn. I was reflecting about my life, and
mhm.
that was when I kind of was in my early career.
Yeah.
And I took bold steps. I was like once because I had a cadetship, and once I
Mhm.
completed that, I obviously was able to do what I needed to do, and I completed that around 96, which was kind of
Mhm.
just around that time. And once I had finished that, I started taking steps around my career. Now, this is why it's important from an individual perspective. Have a look at where Aries is in your chart. And
Mm.
that's going to be also the tone. So if you're not having a Saturn return, um, you're going to be impacted, or not impacted. The influence is basically where Saturn's going to be transiting in your chart. Obviously, there's going to be other aspects, but if you just look at the house, and for me, that my house was the house of every day,
Mhm.
and it was to do with work. So for me, I just took bold steps. I remember applying
Mhm.
for a job for a senior position, and I clearly was not senior at that stage. And I actually got the job.
Yeah.
They recognized that I wasn't senior, but they were wanting to put me into the position, obviously not to the full depth of getting a senior job. And that was me being a little bit cocky, perhaps, or maybe I was just kind of like, why not?
Yeah.
So
Why
I
not?
think that's an example of just taking bold moves,
Yes.
asserting yourself I mean, I wasn't cocky. I think well, maybe I was a little bit, we were young, but you know what I mean? But I think there's a level there that, it can drive you. So the Aries drives you, and Saturn gives you that structure and foundation. And I think that is why I'm sharing this story, because I kind of feel like that was my experience, whereas more of integrated approach, where
Yeah.
I
Okay.
was driven to take action, believe in
Mm.
myself, but also there was a responsibility and a framing around that. And
Mhm.
I think, it can go either way, but what we would like, or like what I like to advise listeners, is that we want to draw on the strengths of both of these elements.
Definitely. Yep.
And often when it's in conflict is because we're not bringing those two, like you said, it's not, Saturn's not comfortable in Aries, because Saturn's naturally ruled by Capricorn,
Mm.
very grounded,
Mhm.
earth, you know energy, whereas Aries is explosive, and directive. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
my kind of thinking. What's your thoughts
Yes.
around that?
I love what you said because it actually fits with my story in the fact that, yes, that's how I got to be where I was. So whether I coped with it or not, another thing. But I was stepped into the confidence. I took the role. I did this. I did that. But in actual fact, all that foundation has stuck with me. It's helped me for the rest of my life. So it is a foundation regardless of how you coped with it, at the time. So what I find interesting is actually, we're at this point where we can start an exciting new chapter. And I think for me, it's about tapping into that enterprising spirit. Like, what is that? Like, what is an enterprising spirit for you? And I think harnessing the energy in a thoughtful, practical way, instead of boldly going where no one's gone before, it's just like, how about taking that little bit slower, that slower pace? And plan is favored right now. Make a plan. It can be very beneficial. So ultimately, it's finding that balance between being enthusiastic, blind faith, going with everything, or
Yep.
being that practical adult. And sometimes, like, let's face it, practical adulting can be boring. Sometimes we just want to go, gung ho. But I think it's about bringing it back. Aries being like that, like being mindful of the aggressive side in some people. I think that stern Saturn father, you know, wants to temper the fire with reason. So it's like Saturn, yeah, I feel it's a very beneficial transit if you can actually find that balance between the two and actually pull the best of both worlds, like you said. What else? I think definitely the things that we were talking about, that accountability and taking responsibility and setting your foundations. There's a whole opportunity for self-mastery here on a personal level. And I think that I missed the boat a little bit previously, but not right across the board. I don't think that is bad. I just see it. I saw it all for what it was. So, and really, we've got a few opportunities here. So I think from now until, like, it's only here for a few months, and then it goes retrograde. So it goes back into Pisces. And what I feel we could do then is sort of review our goals, our commitments, and our structure of what we've done over this 3 months, because that could be a great start. And then address them and also have that reality check. Obviously, it's a good time to reflect on our spiritual growth and our energetic boundaries, because that's one of the biggest, that's huge. Going from that, the dissolving of boundaries to actually setting strong boundaries is huge. And you know what? That has been a huge lesson over the last few months. And I don't know if any of the listeners have experienced this, but for me in my life, my boundaries have really become stronger. So I think I'm coming into that energy more and more, because I think with it in Pisces, there was certainly, a good learning curve around that. And you do hear stories. So I think that's true. And then I guess the last thing, while it's in retrograde, it's like, if anything doesn't seem quite ready, you can actually recognize that a necessary speed bump could be a blessing in disguise. Something stops you or slows you down, it can be a huge blessing. So I really love that. And I think it's the opportunity to make those changes. Now, when does it go? Oh, September the 1st. Is when it ends in Aries, or beginning of September. And then of course our big marathon starts for real for the next few years at the beginning, like in February next year. So we've got a little taster. We've got a time to set down a few foundations. We've to get a feel for this energy, I guess, knowing that it does last that long. And I think we've just got this, there's a whole new threshold, and I feel, I don't know, maybe call me optimistic if you like, but I feel there's opportunities, great opportunities. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know. What do you feel?
Absolutely. I think I do. I actually feel, I think I've worked with Saturn for some time, because I do have a prominent Saturn in my chart. And,
Mm,
I've learned that, yeah, slow and steady, but it's there to set those foundations and guide you ahead. And I think, to your point about it retrograding, is that we have a little bit of a taster. So it's really important to observe, because I think this
mm,
early phase and then the retrograde is where we need to hold the space to observe what's happening. Because
yeah.
when it retrogrades, it enables us to, like you said, reevaluate, reassess, or
Mm,
maybe access something that you need to bring with you. Because the idea around Saturn moving back into Pisces is that you have to retrieve something that you've gained or learnt in that transit, that you bring with you. It's kind of like the little, I call it like the little golden nugget, the trinket.
nugget.
That's
Mm,
going to
mm,
say the lessons of Pisces and Saturn. When you work into that retrograde, what is that little golden nugget that you bring with you? And, the thing that popped up for me with Pisces, I know we talk about blurring of lines, but it's also very in tuned. It's very, you know,
intuitive. Yep.
intuitive and connected. So when we're talking about the self, which is Aries, if we can bring in that intuition and trust it to guide us, to
Yeah.
propel us forward, I think
Hmm.
that's kind of the things that, people should start tapping into, is like, what is that thing I need to retrieve, bring with me? We have a little
Mm,
cameo, and then it's going to be the next few years where you can actually then be guided. Because some of the points that I took note of around navigating Saturn in Aries, and that polarity between these oppositions of Saturn and what Aries represents, because Saturn's responsibility, Aries is like, I don't want responsibility, I just want to just do, I just want to do it. So
yeah.
it's kind of like some of the points I'd note was like, build confidence through consistent action. That could be something, because, Aries is about action.
Hmm.
Channel your anger. So if anger does pop up for you, and it probably is a lot for a lot of people at the moment, into assertive purpose.
Yep.
like
This
use
is
it
it.
to drive purpose.
Hmm.
Commit to authentic leadership. What does that mean to you? When we see, when I was reflecting on what happened back in the 60s where we had Martin Luther King and John, Kennedy assassination, they were pioneers in terms of leadership, and they were assassinated during this particular transit, but
Mm.
it brought an uprising and people stood up for what they believed in. And I think
Yes.
authentic leadership is really coming from that's like I think a real
That's the key word, authentic leadership. I like that.
authentic leadership.
Mm, mm.
And then maybe start something meaningful for you. But put yourself as, sometimes, the challenge with Aries, it's always about me, or the I. But in this case, I think we need to allow ourselves to do something for ourselves as well, because it's what we believe in, it's what we're going to be passionate about, it's what's going to drive us.
Yes,
So do
definitely.
that, but do it with a pace, because Saturn's like, just calm down a little bit. Use that passion and desire and drive, but just like you said, put some framing and structure around it. And that's when you'll yield long-term results and outcomes. So, yeah, and
Mm.
I think, people who are experiencing their Saturn return the second time round, this is what I think is a really, because they've already experienced their first Saturn hit, and this is an opportunity where you can go back in time and go, okay, where have I landed now? Have I done the work? And I
Yeah.
think uh, a Saturn return the second time round, if you've done the work, you're going to experience an evolution, or your own revolution.
Mm.
But if you haven't, you'll probably be slapped in the face, and that's going to literally be your cue around, have you done the work around your own assertion or anger or whatever that Saturn
Yeah.
story was for you. The big
Mm.
changes, the big shifts, because we know that's what happens with Saturn. Saturn returns always marks a major life transition or shift.
Sure does.
Yeah, so
Mm.
do you have any guidance? Because you've experienced obviously your first Saturn. I'm not really sure how old you are,
Yeah,
Robyn.
yeah. So, and the second, it's done, gone.
It's done. So you've
Well, it's,
done both. So
yeah.
from personal experience perspective, did the second return give you any insights that because you were saying your first one or not your first one back
Yeah.
then.
Yeah,
Like
earlier days definitely and not so one well, like I don't like labeling them not so positive or whatever, but obviously I hadn't done the work and I needed to do work. And in the first one. Second one, no, it was for me it was much simpler, but there was still a learning of what had to go and what needed to build. So and for me, well, that's a whole thing is in itself, isn't it? I just love looking at the Saturn returns, and you could talk about that forever. But yeah, I found the second one much more smoother, I guess. Whereas the first one, I had no idea about it really. Like I wasn't even consciously taking
yes,
note. It's only
take
when I look back, I go, "Whoa, what in the hell happened there?" You know. So,
exactly. And that's
yeah,
why it's great to, when I, you know, talk about astrology with people, if they don't know their chart or they're not really sure about what time they were born or whatever it is, I ask them a few basic questions, like even by what their age is, because it gives me some clues. So, if I know whether they've had a Saturn return or they're about to have one. And often, I've met quite a few people who are in that precipice of moving into a Saturn return. And I love to give them guidance around that because I wish I had it. But you can go back in time and you always know that I ask this question with anyone who's already had a Saturn return, what their experiences was during that time. And it was
yep,
always about a change, a shift
yep, definitely.
around responsibility, around personal ownership, whether it's getting married or divorced or having a
Mm,
child, or, my
mm,
Saturn story was I quit my job and traveled the world. There were these major decisions where we take ownership around what we want to do and move forward. So
yeah,
it's and that's what I think I love about it being in Aries, is that it needs a bit of a propel because we have had it in
yep,
that very elusive, Pisces energy. So,
Mm,
there's some really other, other things that we need to think about around this future that we have, and how
yes.
and where we sit and where do we want to go with it.
Mm, agreed. And I think looking at Aries' role in this is sort of setting the stage for a personal revolution, like you said, and thinking about fearless, reinventions. You can even, like I said about the identity, it can even be who are you, and how are you showing up and what are you doing, but I think that purpose is very significant. Um, and also the new boundaries, because let's face it, there's you've got to, it's got to find its way and a place in that, with this transit. And I think the main thing is no apologies in pursuit of your purpose. I think all too often we or people can shy away from leadership for fear of what? Failure, or fear of, not wanting to be seen, visibility, all sorts of things. So it's about actually taking that by the reins and actually moving forward and going, this is my time to do this, whatever this is, and make no apologies. It's not apologetic. Saturn's not apologetic. It's setting up a framework for you to go unapologetically into what it is that you desire. And Aries is there to give it the momentum. But just like I said, it's sort of, let's just like tame that fire a little. and there, yeah. So that's where there has to be this working together of this energy. And I just love, like, there's so much more, isn't there? All these transits this year. So, and when we bring Neptune in the mix, well, there's a whole other story. So, Tanya, we can talk about these till the cows come home.
We can, or perhaps we can do a wrap up. And the last thing I kind of wanted to maybe draw on again from
Yeah.
an archetypal energy, and I think it does kind of sum up a lot of the things that we're talking about. But in tarot,
Yeah.
Saturn is the world, which is about this full cycle. And I think, this coming to a sort of, when the traditional tarot deck has, the figure, the kind of naked figure with a sash across them, they're a bit androgynous.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yep.
But it's kind of like this free, the fact that they're naked, there's a freedom around it. And I think from a, representation, it's the last card of the tarot deck, which is about completions and cycles. And then Aries is obviously the Emperor, which is, leadership
Setting foundations.
and
Yep.
foundations. So, and then Mars in tarot is represented by the Tower.
Mm.
And I think that's the breaking down
Of old structures.
old structures. It's
Yeah.
that, like I said, that early on when I first started about that generational revolution. It's kind of like standing up for what you want, but in a leadership perspective. It's not about a transformational energy, because we're not dealing with like the Plutos of the world, energies.
Yeah.
This is kind of like
Yeah.
setting the foundations around our own sense of who we are and how we want to lead. And one thing I would love people to think about is leadership is not necessarily a role. I've learned in my career that there have been many people who were in positions of leadership but weren't leaders.
Yes.
And so
We
if you're
know.
not in a position of leadership, you can still be a leader. And
Yep.
that, I think, is also a message around Aries in Saturn, or Saturn in Aries.
Aries, yeah.
So that's my kind of sum up. What about yourself, Robyn?
I don't want to add any more to that, because I think that's absolutely perfect. That yeah. I don't want to say any more because I don't want to take away
Excellent. I
from you.
know, because then
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
go down a rabbit hole and start talking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
God knows what. Excellent. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you everyone for listening to
Yeah,
us talk
thank
about
you.
Saturn in Aries. And yeah, let's see what unfolds.
Yes. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Lightwork Women. If you'd like to find out more about any of the guests on our show and our practitioners, visit our website, lightworkwomen.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.